What are you doing? Something to set this on. The conflict between the politicians and the technicians. The intrusion of techniques into the machinery of the state involves the conflict of politicians and technicians. Let the technicians speak is a leitmotif, I don't know what that word is, of all the journals of the opposition. Dardenne, in his Trois mots les French words, concludes his African inquiry by noting the necessity of allowing the era of the technicians to succeed the era of authoritarian administrators. He sees in this the solution of all the human problems of the Negro peasantry. For example, he contrasts the political decisions of administrators to build barracks and strategic military roads with the technical decisions of agronomists and economists to develop the African cotton industry and to furnish cheap cotton goods to the natives. But Dardenne overlooks the fact that the first decision was not made by politicians, but technicians, the military. He holds too firmly to the idea that technician means engineer. He neglects the technical character of both the Army and the Air Force, and sometimes even the administration. This oversight, which is widespread, often leads to a misinterpretation of certain well-known conflicts of interest. In 1938, many people insisted that there was hostility between the Nazi Party and the technicians, and even the army. But this conflict came to nothing, unless it was the attempt on Hitler, which was made in 1944 after his power had been effectively broken. A Caligula and Stolypine report that a similar situation exists in the Soviet Union. According to Saliga, alongside the communist bureaucracy, which holds the political power through its mass organizations and labor unions, there is a technical intelligentsia, the ITR, which is strongly organized and nonpartisan, and which has created its own cooperative organization. All technicians belong to the ITR, and its role has become more important in proportion as the economic structure is increasingly based on the activities of technicians. The 5-year plan implies a technical framework without parallel. An alleged conflict exists between the Communist Party and the ITR. The ITR seeks to turn out the party on the grounds that the party A. hampers technical development, B. provokes discontent among the workers, and C. intrudes into its decisions certain motives which the technicians cannot accept. It is possible that such a conflict exists. Certain signs suggest it. The Communist Party's fear of the saboteur is doubtless not just propaganda, but there are not enough signs to enable us to form a judgment. Malchowski presents another aspect of this alleged conflict. He writes of a class of very bureaucratic and backward technicians, incapable of modifying their methods to adapt them to technical developments. Preoccupied with the realization of the plan, they ignorantly increase the number of workers or the hours of work, instead of increasing efficiency. The insistence on the old methods of work paralyzes the new mechanical means and diminishes yield even further in view of the magnitude of the labor force employed in the upkeep of equipment. The problem then becomes, who ought to take responsibility for adapting the worker to the machine? Who is to educate the worker? The answer is the local branches of the Communist Party. What's up, baby? Baby. The complexity of the elements of this conflict is evident, and it is difficult to accept without reservation the image of the technical archangel sallying forth to do battle with the megalomaniac let me read this again. The complexity of the elements of this conflict is evident, and it is difficult to accept without reservation the image of the technician archangel sallying forth to do battle with the megalomaniac and rotten politician. Nevertheless, it is probable that in the Soviet Union, as in Nazi Germany, there is a conflict between the two classes. But this conflict cannot be counted on to bring about a change in the regime. As C. Wright Mills has shown, the managers under any regime whatsoever are never anything but executive agents. They are never in a position, publicly or institutionally, to assert themselves against their masters. Conversely, the masters become totally powerless without the complex and secretly all-powerful managerial cadre. So the managers are powerless the managers are never in a position to assert themselves against the masters, and the masters power relies on the managers. So it's like symbiotic. In democratic regimes, there is indeed a conflict between politician and technician, but it is apparently much less acute. Two questions arise. First, how does it come about that the conflict is greater in the dictatorships? Second, how does it come about that the technicians do not take the upper hand in a democracy and overwhelm the politicians, who possess no serious means of resistance? The answer to the second question enables us to dispose once and for all the idea that there is a natural and inevitable hostility between politicians and technicians. As for the first question, there is an easy reply. In a dictatorship, the politician is more demanding and makes his weight felt more heavily, so that the technicians find his decisions rather difficult to tolerate. But then how to explain the fact that dictatorships make the most of the technician, submitting everything to his judgment and integrating everything into the technical system? How to explain the fact that the ITR takes its meaning from the 5-year plan the plan itself being a product of the politicians. How to explain the prodigious technical rise of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany under the sway of the politicians? The orientation of both these regimes was technical. Why do the technicians complain? The answer is that the conflict is not between politicians and technicians, but among technicians of different categories. In the dictatorships, the political aims, successfully or unsuccessfully, to comply with the demands of a political technique. In democratic systems, the politician complies only with the requirements of a technique for getting himself elected. He has an altogether inadequate grasp of the various technical services. He has no direct relation to any of the innumerable technical activities. The politician in a dictatorial system, on the other hand, tends to become a technician and ipso facto collides with other techniques. The new political technique claims to be concerned with all techniques. Indeed, to effect a synthesis among them, synthesis is very likely its real function. But synthesis cannot be achieved at the first attempt, and the claim is not easily accepted by the other technicians. We are witnessing a crisis of adaptation. Political technique is far from realization. It is only in its first stammering stages. Yet it claims to be the science of synthesis, as did theology in the Middle Ages or philosophy in the 18th century. When the engineer protests against the politician's decisions, he may be justified on the grounds that the politician is deceiving himself and is really quite ignorant. But the engineer may also be ignorant of the technical motives behind the politician's decision. The engineer has no conception of the elements necessary to judge political technique on the plane of synthesis. This is indeed a crisis of adaptation, but precisely because adaptation is involved, the conflict does not lead to the overthrow of the regime. So the function of political technique is a synthesis between what the technician synthesis cannot be achieved at the first attempt, and the claim is not easily accepted by the other technicians. Science of synthesis, as does theology. Huh, okay. A similar crisis, practically speaking, does not exist in democratic system where the attempt to form a political technique has just begun. The English, however, have wanted for a long time to introduce technique into governmental operations, and thus to resolve conflicts between politicians and technicians before they become acute. Since the 18th century, the English have been preoccupied with technique of lawmaking. In the 19th century, with Arthur Symons and Bellenden Ken, their express goal was the rationalization and systemization of legislative operations. Their motto was codification, consolidation, purification. Their technical reforms resulted in the creation of offices for the technical editing of legal projects, in uniformity of method, in the use of marginal notes, and in the editing of resumes and tables. The efforts has been resumed in the last few years in Great Britain on the ministerial level. To be able to compete with the technicians, the politicians have undertaken governmental reorganization on the cabinet level with a view to greater efficiency. They have divided up their work systematically by developing numerous so called standing committees, each of which has its rigorously defined speciality. The coordination of these committees is assured by the Cabinet Office, an organ of great originality. The Cabinet Office consists of a small group of highly trained civil servants under the direction of a preeminent secretary, or permanent secretary, sorry. Its function is to prepare the agenda of the cabinet and its committees and to take minutes of the meetings. It is interesting to note that the importance of this office is growing. The technical function which it assumes gives it a kind of supremacy over the whole political complex. Similarly, the United States has shown a desire to establish a truly independent corps of political technicians as opposed to politicians, and to separate completely the political organ of decision from the technical organ of preparation. The task of the expert is to furnish the politician with information and estimates on which he can use or can base a decision. A clearly defined division of responsibility corresponds to this functional division. That is, the expert has no responsibility. The problem is, above all else, to maintain the independence of the technician. He must avoid pressure, involvement in contests of influence, and the personal quarrels of the members of the administration. When the technician has completed his task, he indicates to the politicians the possible solutions and the probable consequences and retires. Unfortunately, the Americans do not consider the inverse problem, which is, objectively speaking, becoming more important. When the expert has effectively performed his task of pointing out the necessary ways and means, there is generally only one logical and admissible solution. The politician will then find himself obliged to choose between the technician's solution, which is the only reasonable one, and other solutions, which he can indeed try but at his own peril, but which are not reasonable. At such a moment, the politician is gambling with his responsibility, since there are such great chances of miscarriage if he adopts technically deviant solutions. In fact, the politician no longer has any real choice. Decisions follows automatically from the preparatory technical labors. Young even claims that in the United States, on very advanced technical levels, unchallengeable decisions have already been made by electronic brains in the service of the National Bureau of Standards, for example, by the EAC, surnamed the Washington Oracle. The EAC is said to have been the machine which made the decision to recall General MacArthur after it had solved equations containing all the strategic and economic variables of his plan. This example, which must be given with all possible reservations, is confirmed by the fact that the American government has submitted to such computing devices a large number of economic problems that border on the political. Even admitting that we are not yet at this stage, we must recognize that every advance made in techniques of inquiry, administration, and organization in itself reduces the power and role of politics. Buddy. Consequently, the opposition between technicians and politicians places the politician squarely before a truly decisive dilemma. Either the politician will remain what he is in a democracy, in which case his role is fated to become less and less important in comparison to the role of technicians of all sorts. A state of affairs already evident in the financial sphere. Or the politician will take the road of political technique, in which case the crisis of adaptation will inevitably arise. If the politician really wishes to continue to exist, he must choose the second solution as the only possible one. The existence of techniques in all other spheres forces him to this choice. Even so, little by little, he is being stripped of any real power and reduced to the role of a figurehead. These techniques entail for him both the possibility and the obligation to devolve a political technique. This does not mean dictatorship, which is a provisional trial form. It means, as we shall see, an inevitable and radical transformation of the political perspective. The Nazi dictatorship and Stalin's regime ought not to be completely identified. I've already stated that Lenin was the first man to create a political technique. For Lenin, and Stalin understood this in a remarkable way, the politician was neither a theoretician nor a chief of state in the traditional sense, but a technician. Lenin's concept makes politics a technique, like the others, but actually superior to them, since it is basically charged with coordinating the other spheres of activity. Political decisions are taken by virtue of technical motives, and it is this fact which differentiates this kind of politics both from the purely doctrinaire communism of the left and from the older opportunism that makes its decisions on the basis of subjective motives, impressions, and reasonings, bearing on the immediate situation and varying with circumstance. When Stalin modified a given organization or changed the content of a plan, he did so not under pressure of facts, but as a function of facts, by applying a precise technique. Of course, it is possible to apply the technique badly. Certain errors may persist because the technique has not yet been fully developed. But the important thing is that the politician is forced to follow the line laid down by the technician. This is the tendency which has become classical in communism. According to this tendency, Marxism is not a doctrine, but a method of thought as well as of action. This political technique is not well understood and may not even be recognized, above all because its ends are not clear. Is it directed toward communism as a whole? Or must distinction be made with Lenin between strategy, which is indeed directed towards communism, and tactics, representing the more specifically technical part in which immediate political problems are resolved in relation to strategy? Tactical decisions are all made rationally to satisfy all possible technical data arising from all coordinate bureaus and organisms. The dysfunction between strategy and tactics enables us to understand the most sensational zigzags of the party line. For example, in 1937, stand against the older the 1937 stand against the older communism, the 1940 pact with Nazism, the admission in 1943 of the Church into the communist framework, the 1947 stand against formalism, that of 1949 against the authors of the plan. These tactical changes can all be explained on the basis of technical reasons of great precision. They do not represent arbitrary decisions of hard-pressed politicians. The growing influence of technicians was further emphasized in 1953 by the selection of 5 technicians to be 5 vice presidents of the Council of Ministers. What you doing, Beep? What are you doing? Naughty. Hey, what are you doing? Hey. You're in a hobby. What are you doing? Naughty. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? The problem posed by Hitlerism was very different. Hitler was a politician who made his decisions without the advice of technicians, and often even despite their advice. His decisions were motivated by subjective, internally generated impulses. This attitude was the more extraordinary in that the Nazi apparatus appeared to be among those which had been best understood and applied the fusion between state and technique. It utilized all techniques to the maximum possible degree, reducing them unconditionally to its service, with the exception of the borderline case of politics. Even so, it is not always correct to assume that politics intervened haphazardly. Very often, the firmest doctrines of Nazism had to yield to technical necessities. Thus, the Nazi propaganda technique twice resorted to actions which were publicly popular, but which were at the same time completely contrary to Nazi doctrine. On one such instance was the Great Propaganda Drive of 1935. At the time of the confirmation plebiscite, we are more democratic than the democracies. The plebiscite was intended to show that the Fuhrer was the true incarnation of the people and that, consequently, the Nazi regime was a real democracy, not an artificial one, as France's was. The second instance was the great propaganda campaign in behalf of liberty. We are defending the liberty of the European man. These two themes, widely used but formally opposed to the Hitler doctrine, arose from the technical necessities of propaganda. It is also known that the financial technique of the Nazi often led to them to act contrary to doctrine. For example, in the case of Jews who were made honorary Aryans, or in the case of certain capitalists who became mainstays of the regime and were integrated into the financial organism of the Third Reich. However, the personal politician decisions of Hitler frequently did upset the techniques of the state. The conflict was particularly keen between Hitler and the General Staff, but it also existed with the Geheimpolizei and with the organs of foreign trade. Hitler ordered the adoption of certain measures the technicians disapproved, and after the fall of Nazism, they blamed every difficulty and misfortune on these arbitrary decisions. In any case, it can certainly be said that the majority of Hitler's personal decisions were unfortunate, notably from the military point of view. It is clear that the future belongs not to Hitler's kind of political action, but to Stalin's. Some important political chieftains may still bypass these techniques, but their situation appears more and more precarious. In the conflict between politician and technician, corruption is a much more serious matter. Political milieus are very generally corrupt. The fact is indisputable, both in democratic regimes such as France and the United States, and in authoritarian systems such as fascism, Francoism, and Nazism. We cannot really speak about the Soviet Union. The vertigo of power and the opportunity to become rich corrupt politicians very quickly. The vertigo of power and the opportunity to become rich corrupt politicians very quickly. To the degree that the state becomes more and more technical, there is increasing contact between politicians and technicians. Though technique tends more and more to have primacy over politics, and technical decisions seem unassailable by parliaments, the takeover of technique can be arrested by corruption. The technician is a man, and in contact with corrupt men, he may well allow himself to be corrupted. He can sidetrack his technique, annul the decision demanded by its strict application, and grant some favor or special privilege which perverts technical action. In such an instance, general interests, the only true object of politics, no longer control technique, and particular interests, which are much more efficient in checking technical action, do. Pure technique represents the general interests, the true politics, and is opposed to the politician who represents the corrupting element, for private and hence politically non-existent reasons. The corruption of politicians is the only factor which can retard the total transformation of the state into a gigantic, exclusively technical apparatus. Even so, the impetus of this movement of transformation is being intensified, and public opinion is orientated towards its success. Public opinion, which counts for a great deal even in authoritarian regimes, is almost unanimously favorable to technical decisions as opposed to political ones, which are usually described as either partisan or idealistic. One of the current reproaches made against politics is that it fetters the normal activity of techniques, which the public generally considers good in themselves. Citizens become angry, for example, when they see the state holding back the development of aviation. In the case of a conflict between politicians and technician, the technician has public opinion behind him. A characteristic instance was furnished by Spain. Spanish fascism ought clearly to have been censured by the democracies in 1945, as was Italian fascism. There were political, sentimental, and doctrinal reasons for doing so. But the military technicians proclaimed that this would be a disaster, and the economic technicians agreed. The United States and Great Britain let Franco survive, and France was ridiculed for closing the frontier. Public opinion, which, particularly after 1944, was sharply anti-fascist, ought to have reacted favorably to this action of the French government. Indeed, the first impulse was to condemn Spain. But after the technicians had shown that such a move would be harmful economically and financially, on the plane of foreign commerce, public opinion began to shift. A callous comparison was made between an ideological action, a noble gesture which yielded nothing, and the judgment of the technicians, who were demonstrating the stupidity of such an ideology. Public opinion wavered for a time, only to turn, after about 6 months, in the direction of the technicians. Can it be said that this was a matter of personal interest? The overwhelming majority of Frenchmen had no direct interest in the matter, yet it ought not to be forgotten that adherence to a technical decision is always a matter of personal interest. As for the technicians, it may be asked why they made the judgment they did. Clearly because they were applying their technical instrument, in which generous or sentimental motives had no place. The technicians, as technicians, told us that the closing of the frontier was disastrous. As men, they might have approved of the action for ideological reasons. It is not at all certain that technicians are still capable of making humane judgments. That, however, is another question. The transformation of the state and the consequent predominance of technicians involves two elements. First, the technician considers the nation very differently from the politician. For the technician, the nation is essentially an affair to be managed. For, rightly, he remains imbued with the private origin of technique. As a consequence, the private and public spheres are poorly delimited. All that the technician can take into account is the application of his instruments, whether in the service of the state or something else, is of small importance. For him, the state is not the expression of popular will, or a creation of God, or the essence of humanity, or a modality of the class war. It is an enterprise with certain services which ought to function properly. It is an enterprise which ought to be profitable, yield a maximum of efficiency, and have the nation for its working capital. The influence of the technician on the state does not reside solely in the conditions he imposes through his administrative decisions or in the schema of good organization he draws up. It resides also in the judgments he makes concerning governmental and administrative efficiency. I have discussed the transformation of the system of public accounting. A new and remarkable example of this is furnished by the Netherlands. The problem there is to evaluate the efficiency of governmental services as a function of their cost prices. Every organization, we are told, must in principle establish a valid relation among men, ends, and means in respect to their productive efficiency. Productivity, which seemed heretofore to be a purely economic concept, has made its appearance in the last few years in the political framework. It is necessary to evaluate the cost of every administrative operation and to apply the law of marginal yield. Funds are assigned to each department on the basis of a standard cost established through service. By introducing modern double-entry bookkeeping, it is possible to carry out a constant inspection of activities on every level and to establish the relation between actual and standard expenses. In this way, the law of the technician transforms the administrative perspective. Every administration becomes an object, as formerly the worker became an object in Taylor's hands. Politics assigns the goal, but the technician dictates the means to the last dot. We have a detailed description of this orientation in Gabriel Arden's book. The entire administration is only a machine whose operations must become more and more rigorous. In this way, that ideal theoretical situation is attained in which, to use the words of James K. Freely, Jr., the margin of chance between intention and realization is almost nil. For, according to Freely, the smaller this margin becomes, the more a check on execution appears possible, and the more the coefficient of predictability is increased. Such a situation would give maximum security in all the different administrative units, and what Feely proposed as a theoretical ideal becomes practical. The only price tag on its attainment is the conversion of the administration into an apparatus, the civil servants into objects, and the nation into a supplier of working capital. The nation becomes the object of the technical state in that it furnishes all the different kinds of material substratum, men, money, economy, and so on. The state becomes a machine designed to exploit the means of the nation. The relation between state and nation is henceforth completely different from what it has been before. The nation is no longer primarily a human, geographic, or historical entity. It is an economic power whose resources must be put to work and to which a yield must be returned. In connection with this yield, the older technicians used the term maximum, but the newer ones use the term optimum. Maximum yield is yield that exhausts and debases the resources of the state in a short interval of time. Optimum yield is yield that attempts to safeguard substance and vitality, the typical example being the TVA. However, this may be, we must regard the nation as an entity whose total resources are to be brought into action precisely because all the different techniques mutually conditioning one another have come into play. Once the technician has commenced his operations, he cannot recognize any limits. He cannot esteem or respect anything in the nation except the nature of things. This promotes the greater coherence of the state nation, which is so characteristic of our times. What is true on the national level is also true on the level of international organization. In view of the radical setbacks experienced by the political organisms designed to foster international agreement, it was decided to entrust further exploration along these lines to a group of technicians. It was believed that international consideration of the areas to be exploited, rather than purely national interests, would be more propitious to an entente. Thus, in 1949, a great assemblage consisting of 550 scientists and technicians opened its deliberations at Lake Success to consider how best to exploit the world's natural resources. International projects of this kind are much less advanced than similar international projects, and reactions of politicians to the technicians are correspondingly more enthusiastic. This was evident at the 1949 Strasbourg Assembly of the Organisation Europeenne de Coopération Économique, a purely technical group. The Americans were of the opinion that this organization did not progress as quickly as the technical situation permitted. We are witnesses at the inception of, on the international level, of the same takeover by the technicians which we have already observed on the national level. The second element implied in the transformation of the state and the predominance of the technician is the progressive suppression of ideological and moral barriers to technical progress. The old techniques of the state were a compound of purely technical elements and moral elements, such as justice. The moral elements are not completely negligible even today, although they by no means occupy the place of honor accorded to them in official discourse. The techniques employed by private persons are usually techniques in a pure state and contain no admixture of moral elements. We shall see later on that this is no random fact, but the result of the very nature of technique. The state is charged not only with maintaining respect for law and order, but also with establishing just relations among its citizens. It therefore imposes limits on the pure technique of private persons. Thus, from the beginning, the liberal state forbade the free manufacture of explosives and substances pernicious to health. On a higher plane, it against the trust, an economic organization notorious for social injustice. On a higher plane, it struggled by means of antitrust laws, as in the United States, against the trust, an economic organization. It also established labor legislation limiting the abuse of the workers by mechanical techniques. In the area of justice, the state has been a barrier and check against private technical abuses. But when technique became state technique, when technical instrumentalities passed into the hands of the state, did the state adhere to its old wisdom? Experience must answer in the negative. The techniques to which the state opposed checks when they were in the hands of private persons became unchecked for the state itself. There is no self-limitation in this respect. The English state forbade traffic in narcotics, but made wide use of them in India and China. An omnipotent state, fascist or communist, ceases to respect laws made for the protection of labor. The communist state proclaims this to be a provisional solution pending the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But we can make no judgment of future events. This is not merely a case of precepts legibus blah, but something much more profound. The state is the only barrier between men and the techniques of individuals, but it ceases to be a barrier when technique, increasingly geometrically, encounters the ancient raison d'etat. What the fuck is that word? The state's higher interest, which may be invoked as an excuse for the state action contrary to the justified on. This last, which perhaps has nothing to do with the nature of the state, but nevertheless existed almost continuously throughout history, but the raison d'etat never possessed the means to express itself. It operated sporadically and incoherently, and its decisions often miscarried. It remained more an intention than a reality, but was always latently there. Primarily, it represented the justification by the state of itself. It was the negation of morality by the state. But the means at the disposal of the state were themselves subject to a strong moral influence. They were consequently neither technically nor morally adapted to the raison d'etat, which was deprived of any force without these arms. The state's higher interests require morals and technical adaptation. The French Parliament under absolute monarchy or the French administration under the Restoration, for example, were not adapted to this objective. But when new techniques refined the old ones lost their internal curbs. The state then found itself in possession of means agreeable to the raison d'etat. As soon as it had these means, it applied them without hesitation because it entertained no doubts at all as to the excellence of its ends. At the same time, other techniques, the result of the activity of individuals and until then restrained by the state, came into the hands of the state, which well understood their usefulness for realizing its constant objective. How could the state be expected not to exploit a judiciary without independence and a police without any faculty of judgment? But the most noteworthy fact in this complicated development is that henceforth the raison d'etat could only be the expression of the multiplicity of techniques which it had employed to realize itself. Oh, what the fuck? Yo, is my shit's like overheating. Holy shit. Crazy. Was it cooling off now?